So, hello everybody. I'm Enrique Arellano from the Four Cycles Institute for Psychotherapy in Barcelona, Spain. And I have here with me for you to get to know Dr. Suzanne Midori Hanna, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist from the United States. She will be with us for a webinar on March 25, just around the corner, and for the four module master classes with her that we will be talking in just brief time. But let me introduce you to her. Susan Midori Hanna is a distinguished clinician, educator, and author in the field of marriage and family therapy with over 30 years of experience. She's held academic positions at several institutions, including serving as a professor of counseling and family sciences at Loma Linda University, where she had coordinated medical family therapy placement and integrated neuroscience into her classes. Additionally, Dr. Hanna has been a faculty member and program director for the COAM FTE, accredited programs in Washington, Kentucky, California, and Minnesota. She taught last at Capella University. Through her career, Dr. Hanna has been committed to providing evidence-based, relationship-focused health and mental health care to care for the most disadvantaged groups. Among her publications, such as the practice of family therapy, key elements across models, and the transparent brain in couple and family therapy, mindful integrations with neuroscience have been translated into multiple languages, reflecting her global impact. So let us welcome Susan Midori Hanna with us for this interview. Hello, Dr. Hanna, Susan, if I may.
Please, please, Suzanne. Thank you, Enrique.
Yes.
It's wonderful to be here. I'm so pleased to be here.
So please share a bit with us. How did you start your passion for family therapy?
Well, a lot of family therapists will say we started in our families, but I won't take you back that far. Only to say that because I was raised in a very multicultural environment. Albuquerque, New Mexico is a place where there's the largest Native American powwow in the whole United States. And we have such a wonderful mix of Hispanic. I was raised, by the way, with Spanish speakers all around me. And I was so rebellious that I took French in high school instead. And now I've lived to regret it. But nevertheless, as I grew and decided to get advanced training for myself after university work, I began to see just the importance of family and more broadly, the importance of family, community, and the social environment. These days, I call myself a social ecologist because we have families in all kinds of, configurations. And so because of that, sometimes marriage, for instance, can mean one thing to people. Family can mean another thing. To those who are suffering from a lot of trauma, sometimes the traumas have come from their families. So as I began to process my own contribution to the world, I looked at how important it was to try to help families function better. That's where I started. But that was with their children. Pretty soon, I realized that all families are embedded in cultures and in social environments that impact their family process. And so it sort of ballooned for me to looking more at social ecology, those kinds of things. And that's what actually then catapulted me into a study of the brain and looking at the brain as a social organ. And from there, then I began to see that from the history of our mind-body sciences in the world, that early on, we were taught to separate mind from body. And that began to change with research. So I became devoted to the kind of research that would show the connectedness between mind and body. And by the time that I was doing medical family therapy, then I was already starting to look more at the invitation to see mind and body together, because the medical field was starting to do that more and more. So that's a little of how I got into this. It just sort of ballooned from the family is important, to then the social ecology of the family is very important. And then historically, how our thinking was narrowed down to separate mind from body, and what happens, all the wonderful possibilities that happen when we see how mind and body are actually the same, since the brain is part of the body. We were just persuaded not to think that way for some centuries.
I understand. So like in systemic family therapy, the thinking is about interpersonal relationships within a family. And in many therapies, the focus is like on one person's psychology, what's happening to the client, what's happening to the client, what's happening to the client. And in other traditions, there are two-person psychology. What happens between therapist and client? What happens between therapist and client? And also in neurobiological therapies, there is a broader context, right?
Yes, much broader. And it was so refreshing when I began to see this change really in our knowledge base. Um, a lot of practitioners, including myself, sometimes don't have time for empirical studies that are not directly outcome studies of therapy. And so sometimes research in my earlier years was sort of a necessary evil rather than something that actually informed my practice. But the more we've advanced with that, there are such good outcome studies, some that are too narrowly focused, but others that are really revolutionary in their focus. Because, for instance, John Gottman started putting electrodes on people during his sessions, even young children. And he would have parents and the child problem solve something while the child has electrodes on, and to then track their parenting and their problem solving process with that child. Well, that was revolutionary. And that began, there were times in the US when John Gottman had standing room only. I was one of those standers sometimes where we would do anything just to get in and to start getting our heads around what happens when we're actually monitoring, in his case, a child's nervous system while parents are speaking with that child.
Wow.
It was revolutionary.
This is Gottman from the Gottman couple therapy.
Yes, the famous John Gottman, who now works with his wife, and has created the.
Yeah, I think they're yeah, they have done a lot.
But he was schooled by a neuroscientist who many of us know now from the world of neuroscience. We didn't know that there was a connection. This is sort of like little professional gossip, that there was a connection with John Gottman, and that is Stephen Porges. Stephen Porges was at the University of Chicago when John Gottman was a young child psychologist. And John got his neuroscience training from Stephen Porges years before either of them were really starting to, yeah, be prominent and published, you know. And then the rest is kind of history. But when I learned about that, it made sense to me how lucky we are to have had people pioneer in these areas when it was not only not fashionable, but in some respects, therapists like myself had said, you know, research is kind of a necessary evil. It doesn't help me to be creative. It doesn't help me to be, you know, to bring out the humanity in my work anymore. The brain science research has converted me, you know, from that position, and I can bring out more humanity when I understand brain functioning. I call it biological empathy is the term that I use. It helps us to have biological empathy, and there's nothing more lonely than a person having a biological process that no one understands.
So how does this elaborate into your own work, actually?
Well, so what's happened in my own work is I've gone and expanded the interpersonal, what's going on between people. Um, how can we track what's going on, you know, between people, and then incorporate a knowledge of the nervous system functioning and watching for signs of nervous system dysregulation during sessions, you know, during my process, you know, with a person alone. So for instance, if I have someone who's highly anxious, in a first interview, I am not going to suggest that I'm going to be their therapist. I would rather them have a sense of choice and control, particularly if early on we discuss the fact that they've had significant trauma. So the idea of a person needing to have control um, of a session, that's, you know, we have a lot of words for that that are sometimes pathologizing a person for needing control or having, you know, certain sensitivities, you know, in a session. Now, I expect that, and then what I want to do is honor that part of them and then allow them to have full choice of, so let's you and I decide how you feel about being here with me. If there's something that doesn't seem to fit, I can always give you some referrals to some other therapists, and then you can sort of decide, compare, and decide for yourself who you feel most comfortable with. Now, see, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily do that. By the end of the session, what I also do then is create an environment that makes it okay for them to be internally who they are. One client said, "My family's afraid of me." Oh, tell me more. Well, because when I lose my temper, they get scared. This was when she was 10 years old. And so with someone like that, she needs to know that I can handle her anger, that I can handle, you know, that does not bother me, and that I feel comfortable, you know, with her anger. What that also does now that I never had the words for before is that's me providing some co-regulation for her. And in our webinar, we'll talk about a number of different ways that co-regulation can happen. Um, not necessarily that I've done this in my practice, but Bessel van der Kolk has one line in his famous book about how co-regulating it can be to actually dance together and with the rhythm of the music and being in, sync with a dance partner or in a dancing line, that can be incredibly co-regulating. So again, we'll talk about many different versions of co-regulating, but in a session then, that's going to be the first thing when I start picking things up about a person's nervous system, then I will reach out and speak to their nervous system is kind of how I think about it. And then that leads to, this is how I would, address your problem if you decide that that would fit for you. And it's always then tentative so that people have a chance, because people in trauma know that they could have triggers around the most embarrassing things. And so they will need to know that I have like a large range of comfort with what might be triggers that neither they or I yet know are going to come out in a session.
Wow. And let's go back to the family context. Do you still see families or groups?
So now part of what I do is much more culture related. Um, I worked for 10 years doing pro bono work with homeless people. And during that time, sometimes we would meet in a fast food restaurant because they were homeless. Sometimes we met in a library. Sometimes we met in a park. Um, the environment for my work with these homeless people really changed my way of thinking about how I could have influence and where I could have influence. And so that last 10 years of my practice was very unconventional by most people's standards. And so it's not necessarily always going to translate, to office-based work. But what does translate, is this nervous system stuff. And and for instance, a number of homeless people had families that I was able to access and get to know and work with. And it's fascinating that some of the most troubled, homeless people, their families have felt so helpless that there was a large piece of psychoeducation and also then uh, the psychoeducation and then working with families around their trauma regarding trying to interact with their homeless member.
Wow.
So there was a lot of that that has happened over time. And so a lot of it would be with these really high needs homeless people. And
Mhm.
then um, going ahead and negotiating with their families. They might be just on a long distance call with me. They might be, um, in person, but some of them, I've had families where they said, I will only talk to you if you promise not to give my family member my contact information, because we were practically driven insane ourselves from having to deal with somebody who had fallen through the cracks and was not able to get treatment anywhere. So the family was traumatized. And so a lot of my work was more in tandem because of that. Family members, lots of times adult siblings and parents, and then the homeless person who might have been out on the street for, a couple of decades.
Wow.
And so my most recent practice has been like that. I do a little less of that now and a little more of looking at larger systems and how they can begin to provide much more co-regulation. Um, for instance, some church communities will have some positive effects on a person's nervous system and negative effects. It depends so much on the actual religious environment of that faith community. So I'll sort of size that up now to see whether or not some communities, not just faith-based, by the way, but other service communities might be an arena where my client might be able to get more co-regulation. And so essentially, we may be creating a surrogate family. And I'm actually not the only, this didn't originate with me. We've had these kinds of things for a long time, where we work with who we have but because my commitment is to systems being able to become a surrogate tribe or family. And these days I do use tribe because of my emphasis and my valuing of indigenous communities. And that's been the other influence as I've watched indigenous communities take a hold of their own mental health healing. I really have had to sit back and think about, these homeless folks that I have worked with for the last 10, 15 years, but also other cases that were more traditional, and how so many of our clients and families, the families may be isolated. And so can I help this family be connected, more connected to a tribe, or to develop, a tribe for themselves that is healthier?
And what have been your success cases? Where have you felt that your approach has been fruitful for and that make you continue?
Well, it's interesting because in some of the cases, this will sound not, it's just very non-traditional, but I had one case where she was actually living in a substance abuse halfway house simply because they wanted the county money for filling a bed. She did have schizophrenia. She was made to go to AA meetings that can be highly emotional, and they're not at all a fit for someone who has, uh, schizophrenic symptoms, a childhood where she was beaten up and had head injury, as a child. So I met with her for a while. I discovered that she had writing in a journal, and that was one way that she sort of worked, with herself. The other way was out on the street. She found a church that had quite a few services, free food, and some other things. And to get their services and also their fellowshipping, she would rather live homeless in the alley than live in this halfway house that was ill-suited for her symptoms. So I had no choice but to help her with her sense of self-determination. And she left and went back to the church who had originally sort of, referred her. But then it was a matter of helping the church understand how much they were already helping her, and what were some ways in which, because they didn't want her living in the alley, not, just for her sake. They didn't mind. I had another man who would go into the boiler room of a church during winter. And that was all because the ministers, were just so anxious, to be able to help in any way that they could. And um, so in that way, sometimes I then will work, with these other agencies because they don't know how much good they're doing compared to traditional sort of
Medical setting,
avenues, you know,
like
and
primary care, things like
and it was almost malpractice for her to be placed in that facility. And so again, then, she was able to um, go back to what was familiar for her. And then the church felt more empowered that they were doing her some good. And then I followed her for a time. and really encouraged her to start doing more and more journal writing because she had already been doing that. And so sometimes folks are doing what is actually the best for their nervous system. And if it isn't in our toolkit, we may not know to emphasize it. So that's the other thing that happens now in my work is I look at what are they already doing, and it's a little bit like solution focused therapy, but it does go beyond how we would normally, think of it. And then I branch out to see what are the things that maybe they're doing randomly that could become more systematized. And, Milton Erickson coined the phrase utilization. Well, so for those of you that might be familiar with Milton Erickson's work, that was utilizing anything that the client might be already naturally doing. So I'm much more affirming and I do much more investigating about hobbies, about things that they might not even think a therapist would care about. One client, uh, she played the piano. She could sit down and bang out a Beatles song on the piano, but she was mute, electively mute in our sessions for about 4 sessions. She could not talk. So she would write me letters and I would write her back. And then when she came to, therapy, then I would respond to the last letter that I got, from her. And finally, so it was sometimes my monologue to, as a response to her letter. After about 4 sessions, then she started talking. And you know what? It was a genogram, I was doing a genogram, and then that was comfortable for her to make eye contact. I wasn't asking her to introspect in a way that maybe she still didn't have words for yet. And I was honoring her nervous system. See, many people would have all kinds of opinions about not speaking during, allowing a client to not speak and to allow a client to write these copious letters, that was her session, and then my response. But that was the beginning of my nervous system transformation, where a lot of things that I might have had trouble with in the past, they were very helpful to focus on. And then I found out about piano, and we literally went over someplace, a hotel or someplace, where she could just sit down at a free piano, and I was just amazed at the talent.
So very deep connections to her actually true self.
Yes.
And that made her shift.
Yes, it was a pretty fascinating transformation, that particular case. And so just as we might return to her in the webinar also because of
That's great.
What happened.
You also had some interest in working with LGBT community.
Yes, yes, I have. And that's where there's such a degree of trauma that goes on, depending again on the social environment. Now, I have known people, not cases that I've had. They weren't cases I had because their families were so accepting, so inclusive, almost to the point of revolutionary. And this, frankly, was a Mormon family. For those of you, it's a conservative Christian religion. And yet, this one gentleman had a family. When he came out, the parents went to all the siblings and said, "This does not change a thing. He's always going to be part of our family." And then before too long, she might get a compliment about what she was wearing at church by church people, and she would say, "Oh, thank you. My my gay son helped me pick this out." everyone ought to have a gay son. Now, again, see, that was no influence from me. In fact, like I said, this was not a case, but it gives you an idea that there's a range of wonderful people that are in the lives of our LGBTQ folks. And that range includes everything from what I would call in the 1% of excellence, on one end, to then the tragic uh, destruction that happens at the other end, disowning people, lecturing about their evil condition, all of those kinds of things, and everything in between. So it's so important for me with their nervous system to look at what their history is and the development of their nervous system during their own trajectory as they become aware of their own orientation and then begin to transition, so to speak, not necessarily transgender, but
No.
deciding, when and how to come out. And as that transition for them happens toward coming out, I'm looking then historically, what was the condition of their brain? What age were they? We will talk in the webinar quite a bit about Bruce Perry's model of working with severely abused children. And his work, coupled with the other neuroscience work, does give us a sense of how old was that nervous system when this was happening or this was happening. So our brains don't fully develop until age 24-ish, give or take. In that full development, then we can backtrack ages, and really in the child development world, they do quite a good job of already tracking children's brain development, just not the nervous system part. And so, I will take a look at that with LGBTQ folks, because the earlier that they've had to harbor a secret that was based on their, again, being considered evil or bad, you can kind of do a little equation almost, what was the social environment, the family environment like? And on a continuum, how neutral or supportive was it versus neutral or negative? And at those earlier ages, then Bruce Perry calls it states versus traits. A state of being in danger at an early age is going to result in certain behaviors, whether it's keeping everything to themselves or acting out in various ways in younger years. Well, the behavioral manifestations usually get labeled as personality rather than a nervous system state that is a response to survival in the social environment, and that has become chronic.
Mhm.
So these chronic states, I find they're important to everybody, but I use them really in a deliberate way with the LGBTQ population after I determine, just what would have been the state and the history of their nervous system in this certain environment. And then let's start there with some co-regulation. And then, so I might have somebody who's 25 years old and their family is disowning them. Well, their own sense of themselves and their own nervous system panic may have started at age 5 or 6. So I'm going to want to honor the age of their nervous system when it first, became a state, a chronic state, and then was misconstrued as personality. And so there may be 5-year-old, I start saying to myself, what does a 5-year-old need? what does a 10-year-old need?
Yeah, you go through the developmental arc of life.
Yes. Right. And then I'm going to be a therapist for a 5-year-old for a while or a 10-year-old for a while, even though this is somebody, that's 25 years old. And we talk about this because if I can co-regulate with them, then that will sharpen their cognitive ability because I'm sort of addressing and calming down. Um, Bruce Perry calls it regulate, relate, and then reason.
Yes.
So I provide regulation at the nervous system. A 5-year-old might be fidgeting or might need, something a little different than even a 10-year-old. But that's the regulation piece that I would honor in somebody that was 25 years old. So 5-year-old regulation piece, relate is relationship. So can I meet them at their level? And also, do they have, supportive people in their interpersonal world? Because I'm more than happy always, even if it's only a pet, I'm happy to include whoever they list as a favorite person or a safe person. If it's somebody that they wish they could change, I'm going to hold off on that for a while and just stick with favorite, favorite, safe, and see then whether or not there's some potential to involve someone. Like when they leave the session, who might they actually talk to about the session? Well, okay, if they feel safe in that regard, then hey, could we invite them in? Because then that's part of their tribe that I'm going to want to use to help their nervous system grow up the rest of the way and then go into, our regular cognitive behavioral work.
Oh, take a breath. It's very interesting. Yes, yes.
I should, maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah,
I love my clients, but that's another story.
that's another story. So you have in your blog, in your website, a number of important things that we will be discussing, maybe in the webinars, master classes. You talk about indigenous practices and the new gold standard. You talk about intergenerational trauma. You talk about development, sibling development, invisibility, and trauma healing. Is there any of this that's relevant just now to comment something?
The intergenerational trauma, as a good old-fashioned family therapist, I learned about Murray Bowen's work. He coined our use of genograms, for instance, in my field. And to this day, the genogram is one of the most unique aspects of some family therapy practice. Um, Insurance companies don't care about genograms, so some of us have lost touch, with that. But I've begun to look at Murray Bowen's work. He coined the phrase, the transmission of intergenerational emotion. Well, that was his early capturing of highly, intense emotional states. That was really the beginning of a focus on nervous system. We just didn't have the words for it. And so intergenerational trauma now I find quite easy to just fall into looking from a genogram, what might be the traumas and that have been passed down, and how do they get passed down in these micro interactions, and sometimes invisible. Maybe grandparents are dead, but parents may then have inherited certain patterns, and they may be certain beliefs, they may be certain anxieties. They can often then, be traced back to trauma. I've had children of Holocaust survivors who say, people don't ever think much about the children of Holocaust survivors. But in fact, we also have trauma because they, our parents, don't want to talk about their trauma. And so we can't ever fully know them. We know that there's always, something missing. So um, that's one way that this intergenerational trauma can be passed down. And then with LGBTQ folks, just kind of going back to that topic for a minute, there's so much on the range of, again, family support that can go back when there's lack of support and just downright cruelty that can often go back and be traced back also to intergenerational trauma. And so that figures in not just, with LGBTQ, but my Native American friends, it's usually top of their list because the cultural and intergenerational trauma, um, certainly in the United States and Canada, we're learning much, much more all the time about the ethnic cleansing that governments, and local, um, even again, religions did, to try to take the Indian out of the person by putting them in boarding schools. And I'm sure some of you have heard about that. So
Yes, there's also been also covert aggression in the Spanish Inquisition, in the Spanish conquest of Latin America, and there are still unmet feelings on some sides and justification on the perpetrator side.
yes, yes. And
You're better off that we went there. We were the best, better than the Anglo or than the French. At least we mixed with you.
well, and I'm glad you mentioned that because for sure then I have one category that's just simply called fear-based fear-based socialization. And it can be anything from enslavers who then create a fear-based sort of thing to, again, Inquisition from centuries ago,
Yeah,
fear-based communities were what happened when Rome took over the church.
yeah, this is,
And so then a body of scripture and how it might be translated and all of that can end up having these threads of fear-based socialization because governments were wanting to control. And without getting off on one of my favorite soapboxes, we'll just kind of leave that there. But this is one way in which I will go wherever I need to go in order to offer the people in my room some grace. And that's another piece of what's happened for me in my training. I was raised in a conservative Christian, environment, but I have migrated much more to a Buddhist type of sensibility, which is all grace and no sin. I mean, it couldn't be different from the years of Inquisition or even before. And and so self-compassion was part of the advanced training, how to help clients with self-compassion. Uh, and that's, in the center of much Buddhist
yeah,
work is so it's really easy, to go there. And then how will I give myself grace so that I can stay regulated
yeah,
with folks that, again, both need the grace. And so
yeah,
I use myself to co-regulate, but then cognitively, if I think that they have a good relationship with me, that's sort of the middle, and we've co-regulated our nervous system, so we're calm. And, that may come from humor. They may come in and crack a joke. And, and instead of me thinking that it's avoidance, see, we have all this language still that we're overcoming that, that came from Freudian and psychoanalytic. And I'm the first to say, I still embrace, some pieces of psychoanalytic thinking. But we do need to like parse it out, because then there's so much pathologizing around the wrong things. And so if someone comes in and cracks a joke, I'm not going to think that they're avoiding something, because in Peter Levine's level 1 training, for those of you that know Peter Levine,
Traumatic experience. Yeah.
we were taught about pendulation, reaching a little bit into the trauma and then moving out of it again to more of a position of calm. Well, a joke can be perfectly good way to pendulate. Maybe not therapist initiated, but potentially therapist supported. So if somebody has sort of gallows humor because they're Irish or something, and they crack some joke, okay, because that may be a signal of needing, to pendulate from being touching into the trauma and then moving out of it. And I'm constantly thinking in those terms too, in my mind, swinging in, swinging out, instead of what I'm doing right now, which is like, very intense, sort of nonstop. But I do that too when I get excited, and then I have to like, calm myself.
Beautiful. Yeah, this is a very, very deep work. I have one more question for you for our interview. So the idea of the master classes that you and I have discussed that we will present to the Spanish-speaking population here, or English speakers who may want to join, you're most welcome. You are making all these points in a very thorough way in each master class. We call it the family therapist across the trauma continuum. And I remember in your initial interviews that you have said, gosh, what we see in our offices is not what we were seeing 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. What people are bringing up for our therapy work has changed dramatically. And bringing in this addition point of view, that you are making, neurobiology, ancestral intergenerational trauma, ancestral cultural practices, a more compassionate approach, all these things. Yes, we have also, you were going to mention a second class about attachment and neuroscience. And I remember you mentioned an anecdote of when attachment theory was mentioned at a family therapy conference. Will you speak about that? How was attachment therapy
Well, it was
seen?
interesting. It was, again, it was 15 years ago now. And I had planned on presenting to a small group. And I have to think through whether I should identify the organization or not. I'm thinking that I won't right now. But it was a small, well-known family therapy institute known across the world, actually. And I said I wanted to present because I had started seeing the neuroscience connections with attachment theory. And folks like Daniel Siegel, I was reading his book voraciously, and even what I couldn't understand, I was underlining and then picking it apart and learning what he meant. And that neurobiology of interpersonal relationship was my first Bible, even though it wasn't a family systems. And I actually had lots of colleagues saying, oh, no, that's just so boring or whatever, see, because it's the science, part of it. But of course, if we had known then what we know now about Daniel Siegel's respected work, then they wouldn't have necessarily said that. Although, even with Daniel Siegel's work, he needs a family therapist sometimes and doesn't get it. And so getting back, to this other, presentation that I gave, I had people there that, and it was a small enough group that we could dialogue with each other about this stuff. And they just literally said, attachment theory, attachment theory. You know, I don't know how to get my head around it, attachment theory. And because the early family therapists were so allergic to what was happening in Europe and in England related to John Bowlby's work, what I would hear is, oh, well, that's too psychoanalytic. It's not systemic enough. That would very often be something that was said. In this environment, it was just simply just an out and out candid, we don't know what to do with that. That's not how we think. Now, that was 15 years ago. So much has changed.
Yes,
It's
yes, yes.
wonderful because even if we don't say it, I say, family systems has been good to me and to all of us who have learned about family process and family systems, systems theory. But I do think that attachment theory is actually the basis of even how we use systems theory. Systems theory can be cybernetics. It can be a lot of other things, that are not necessarily family or specific, to our micro interactions with each other. But underneath all of that, I think attachment theory is the relational theory that underpins all of our work. And it didn't take long, for a number of people to start seeing, structural family therapy and attachment theory, even though Mnuchin might have, eschewed it early on, but he changed too. If you ever heard him before he died, he was just continued, to be just a wonderful example also of evolution, brilliant mind, and then he evolved too. So nowadays, nobody would say that to me, but
No,
back
no.
then,
Yeah,
I had to,
it
I had
was
to
a
convince them
moment.
to
Yeah,
me.
the same thing happened to me. I have mentioned to a number of family therapists, peers of mine that I know, if they were interested in polyvagal theory, because here I've been working a lot with Dana, with Stephen Porges, and I have been promoting polyvagal theory in Spain. And the answer I got from important people in family therapy is like, I don't see the relevance of polyvagal theory for family therapy. And I see Dana's papers as she's working in the legal system, in the family courts, with regulation, helping children regulate in the courts, coaching families to stay connected and regulated through very difficult, painful moments.
Yes, yes. Well, and see, attachment theory, I think it got over connected in people's minds to psychoanalytic practice
Yeah,
or psychoanalytic thought.
yeah,
And that's something now that we have been able to unravel, I think, better. And for instance, we are going to talk about what Porges, how his work, even it goes into autism now, his work. He has some fascinating work with people who have autism and families who are working with their,
yes, 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 yes.
but also rape victims,
Yeah,
those who have been,
abuse.
sexually molested, and the freeze response. And he's better at articulating freeze response and
Yeah,
how
the fawn, the freeze,
how that plays out in the real world.
yeah,
So again, then Porges' work I use in order to help people develop more self-compassion for themselves.
yes,
And then I also extend grace
yes,
because of Porges's work. So I like to connect those dots for people so that you can see how that, intimidating scientific kind of aura can actually, comes right down to specific things that I do or say with clients
yes,
because of
yeah.
that.
Yes, yes. I'm in this movement of wanting to transmit and provide educational of neuroscience, neurobiology, as you are for clinicians, because it's so important. Yeah.
Well, it is. And the final piece of this puzzle then is rightly so. People might be saying, so she's talking about all of this, but then they were talking about indigenous practices. Now, how do I get my head
Yeah.
around, is it like too much, too much information or too complicated, to think about those connections? And just to set, everyone's mind at ease, once we move into indigenous practices, things get so simple. We don't have to keep thinking. I will, connect the dots with the neuroscience stuff, but in terms of our practices, sometimes the indigenous work makes our practices so easy. And besides easy, so fulfilling, because we also then get connected to a different life force than sometimes what our, normal models would open up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I don't want to get too much, into that right now, but I will say that more recently at a presentation that I gave at a conference, uh, some people got up and when they were, talking to me privately and said, my blood pressure went down by like so many points just from our discussion about these indigenous practices. And so
The
don't,
blood pressure went down.
it's, things may sound a little complicated the
No,
way
no, no. It's
uh,
as we use our bodies, as we use what Stephen Porges calls the social engagement system.
yes,
And as Frank Corrigan and Ruth Lanius work with the brainstem and the middle brain, and EMDR work with the middle brain. All this involves what we see, what we do, how we speak, how we move, how we interact. And it makes sense that maybe a folk dance, a rhythm, a drawing, even it's so may sound like childlike, like stupid, like ridiculous. People would have judgments around doing those things,
yes.
and they
Well,
will alter their state.
and I do enjoy doing some experiential exercises during my presentations. And recently I did was at a presenting at a conference where there were both in-person people as well as on Zoom. And it was fascinating how our experiential time together, it was really not sacrificed with the Zoom people. Um, because we had all kinds of ways of for 5 minutes breaking people into small groups, just even for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And so there was kind of this interesting mesh between the Zoom people and the in-person people. And of course, this is going to be all Zoom, but um, it doesn't really discourage me from having fun with some experiential activities. And when I say fun, also, it's, the experiential stuff just makes things so much easier. That anything that might have felt complicated usually gets sorted out during our experiential time. So, another breath.
Thank you so much. So I think this is very rich for now. There's And we will have the webinar to talk about the 4 master classes that you have created for this institute. And that'd be an honor to continue this and invite community of therapists of Spain and Latin America, and anybody around the world that wants to join in is most welcome. And thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and I'm just so grateful to be able to be part of your community. So I look forward to it.
Thank you so much. Take care.